Hello again and welcome back to the day of daily Bible study. We're going to finish up this week by starting Matthew chapter 23, which is another one of Jesus' kind of discourses, and this one is against the Pharisees. I used this whole passage. I can't remember if I jumped ahead so I could cover it over the course of a season of Lent, or if I skipped over it and then went back to it to cover it kind of as a Lenten reflection, because it really did have a strong emphasis on this kind of the attack on Pharisees here is really something that we in the church need to hear more than perhaps some other things, because Jesus is criticizing not outsiders so much as those who would be insiders, those who identify as being God's people. And one of the things I brought up, I had to been like a dozen times during that season of Lent, was Soren Kierkegaard. And every late winter, usually ends up being about February-ish, is when I reread one of the collections that I have calls it the attack upon Christendom, where he really does join with some of these things. And there's a passage in that attack that is from this chapter that he basically says nobody ever reads this in church because it would be too judgmental, and nobody wants to admit that. And so I made a point of really trying to highlight that. So there's a bunch of really interesting things here. Challenging, yes, but very interesting. So after all these things, Jesus has done all of these answering of questions, and he starts to turn the questions on the Pharisees. And we continue on and says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, 'The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. For they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and chief seats in the synagogue, and respectful greetings in the marketplace, and by being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted.'" Yep, that's the end of that passage there. So it's fascinating that Jesus says, listen to these people. They are good teachers of Moses, good interpreters of Moses. He says the problem is that their interpretation is only skin deep. It doesn't actually affect the way they live. That their brains have understood many things, but it's one thing to understand something, it's something else to live it. And, it's one of the things that they've done studies to find is that they find that a lot of people who are professors of ethics you would think would be particularly ethical in their lives because they spend so much time thinking about what the right things to do in any given situation are. And what they find is that professors of ethics are either no more ethical than your average person, or in some cases they find that professors of ethics as a group might actually be somewhat less ethical in their actual daily lives than your average person. It's a fascinating thing. I couldn't cite you the study, but I do know that's been referenced by several people. And so what we have here is this idea of, do as they say, but don't do as they do. And it's important to realize, so this is actually really interesting because it might shed some light on, some of the issue. We talk about the death of the author, or this idea of if somebody writes something, produces a work of art, produces a work of written material, and then we find out that they themselves turned out to be despicable people, destructive people who have caused a great deal of harm. Does that negate what they had to say? And I have a particular theologian, not my very favorite theologian, T.F. Torrance, but somebody else who subsequent history has shown was either engaged in overtly sinful life or was certainly playing around way too close to that, to the point where there's probably some emotional sinning going on, if not kind of overt sinning. And so there have been a lot of people who have said, maybe we shouldn't listen to this guy. Clearly did not live according to his own perspective. And I know at least one person who said, well, no, the fact of the matter is his own theology would condemn him. And so we can still listen to his theology. His theology is still good. But I do think Jesus here is saying, even the Pharisees, for all their flaws, he says, listen to them. Don't do what they do, but listen to what they say. So I think Jesus actually gives us a little bit of, leverage here for distinguishing between the individual and their teaching. Obviously, what makes Jesus great is that his acting and his teaching are one and the same. He lives what he teaches, and he teaches what he lives. Just so much that's interesting here. Also, because he talks about this idea of the Pharisees who seek places of honor, and he reminds us that we need to not seek places of honor. And that's not always easily done. Sometimes we don't realize that we're given this place of honor, and we have to kind of almost be deliberate about putting ourselves in a place of less honor. What is interesting here is that this is where Jesus says, call no one on earth your father. And I've talked about this before. And it says, it doesn't just say don't call your clergy father. So we Protestants often feel very smug over our Catholic brothers and sisters because they call their priests father so-and-so. But Jesus says, don't call your actual biological dad father because you have one father in heaven, which again highlights something we talked about earlier this week, that this idea of the term father cannot be without significant change applied both to God and to our human fathers. And we need to be making a distinction and always be aware of the fact that when we use a word to describe God and we use a word to describe human things in creation, we cannot be meaning exactly the same thing because that God is entirely other than our experience. I do want to highlight this though. So one of the things that this might be news to some people, unless you're part of this congregation as I serve. I do have a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews. And one of the things that I don't do in the context of church ministries, I don't insist that anybody call me by the title of doctor. In fact, the only person I've ever known who really would, on a regular basis in the church, referred to me by the full title of Reverend Doctor was a gentleman who, every time he referred to me that way, I always knew that whatever's going to come next was going to be a question I wasn't going to have a good answer for. It was pretty consistent in that. What's interesting is I do teach. I was asked to teach 2 classes for in a certificate in theology and ministry program through United Theological Seminary this fall. In classes I've taught before, so it was just a matter of adapting them for a new format. And one of the things that I was asked by the students was, what should we call you? And I said, you should call me Dr. Stevick. But I was trying to be clear about the fact that I really had, the reason for that was because of the nature of the relationship that we had. That they're not my parishioners. They're not, the function here is not that we're not friends gathering together. We are there that I am an instructor for them. My goal is to be a teacher in this context and to have that be our basic thing. I'm not clinging to it. If we ran into each other, if we were at some kind of conference together, you can just call me Travis. It's no problem, But for the purposes of the class, it makes sense to do it that way. And I did comment about the fact that one of the reasons why I don't insist of being referred to by the title of doctor is because I knew that eventually I'd have to preach on this passage where it says they love being called rabbi, which is the Hebrew for doctor, for teacher, and all the rest. And actually, honestly, my other ulterior motive is the fact that many of the students in these classes are significantly older than I am, definitely in a second or even a third career as a pastor. And so, to be honest, there's a level of it that says, I'm the age of your kids or sometimes your grandkids, although not so much grandkids anymore. But I'm definitely in a different generation, a younger generation, and it would be helpful for me if you use the title that will help remind you that you're supposed to be learning from me and that I do have some qualifications to teach. But it's a fascinating passage, and I try not to pretend like this isn't there because I don't want to fall victim to what Jesus is saying here of using titles as a means to cling to and claim honor for myself. And so I hope that you don't perceive me as trying to cling to those kinds of titles. My hope is that it is helpful to people and not just self-serving. But in any case, it's a reminder that those of us in the church, those of us who think of ourselves as being those who are following God, we need to make sure that we are not exalting ourselves, but humbling ourselves so that God will not humble us. That if we humble ourselves, God will exalt us. And that is worth any amount of deferred honor is the honor that God gives. So I want to remind you that whatever it takes for you to put yourself in the place of voluntary humility is definitely effort well done. Not to be abused by other people, but to not cling to titles, not cling to honor, but to serve in one way or another. Well, that's all for today, and that's all for this week. Come back in next week. We'll have more of the Gospel according to Matthew. Have a good day.